Mother-in-law tried to cancel my wedding. I canceled her retirement. Diana, sweetheart, you're just too old for me now. I need someone who can keep up with my energy. Those were the words my husband of 15 years said to me as I found him in our bed with a girl young enough to be his daughter. My name is Diana Foster. I'm 42 years old, and I'm the VP of Operations at Meridian Tech Solutions in downtown Seattle. At 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon in March, I came home early from a client meeting to find my world completely shattered. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I simply stood there in the doorway of our master bedroom, watching my 45-year-old husband Marcus scramble to cover himself and the barely legal brunette who was frantically searching for her clothes. Something cold and calculating settled in my chest as I watched them panic. "Don't let me interrupt," I said calmly, adjusting my designer handbag on my shoulder. "Marcus, we'll talk when you're finished." I turned and walked downstairs to my home office, closed the door, and began making mental notes. The girl looked familiar, but I couldn't place her immediately. What I did know was that my life as I'd known it was over, and I was going to make damn sure I wasn't the only one paying for it. 20 minutes later, Marcus knocked on my office door. He walked in looking like a guilty teenager, his salt and pepper hair disheveled, wearing his wrinkled work shirt inside out. "Diana, let me explain." "Sit down," I said, not looking up from my laptop where I was already researching divorce attorneys. "And please do explain. I'm fascinated to hear how this situation came about." He shifted uncomfortably in the leather chair across from my desk. "Look, Jenna and it just happened. You've been so focused on work lately, and she makes me feel young again. She gets me." Jenna. The name clicked. My blood ran cold as I finally placed the face. Jenna Rodriguez, 19 years old, summer intern in our IT department. I had personally approved her internship application 3 months ago because of her impressive portfolio and enthusiastic cover letter. I had even taken her under my wing, inviting her to executive meetings to give her real-world experience. "How long?" I asked, still maintaining my composure. 3 months, he said, then quickly added, "But Diana, we never meant for 3 months." I repeated the words slowly, letting them sink in. 3 months meant this started the week she began her internship, which meant my husband had been grooming a teenager in my own workplace. While I was mentoring her professionally, he was manipulating her personally. I closed my laptop and looked at him directly for the first time since sitting down. "Marcus, I need you to leave. Tonight. Go stay wherever you want, but don't come back here." "Diana, be reasonable. We can work this out. It's just a phase." "No," I said quietly. "We can't. And it's not." That evening, after Marcus packed a bag and left with his tail between his legs, I poured myself a glass of my best wine and began research. Not just on divorce attorneys, though I certainly bookmarked several of Seattle's most ruthless. I researched Washington state employment law, company policy violations, and the legal implications of workplace relationships involving power imbalances. By 2 a.m., I had a strategy. The background. Marcus and I met in college at the University of Washington. He was studying business. I was in the computer science program. He was charming and ambitious, always talking about the empire we'd build together. After graduation, I quickly climbed the ranks in tech while he bounced between sales jobs, never quite living up to his own hype. When I got the opportunity to join Meridian Tech Solutions 8 years ago, it came with a significant salary increase and stock options. Marcus was supportive, proud even. He loved telling people at parties that his wife was a tech executive. What he didn't love was that my success highlighted his own stagnation. For the past 3 years, Marcus had been working as a regional manager for a medical supply company, making decent money but nothing compared to my 6-figure salary plus bonuses. We lived in a $1.2 million house in Bellevue that I'd purchased primarily with my earnings. The Tesla in the garage, the annual vacations to Europe, the investment portfolio worth $847,000, all of that was built on my career. I'd been blind to the signs of his growing resentment. The snide comments about me working late, the way he'd introduce me as just my wife instead of mentioning my title, the increasing frequency of his guys' nights out and weekend business trips. What I definitely hadn't seen coming was him targeting my intern. The investigation. The next morning, I went to work as usual. I had a coffee meeting with Jenna scheduled for 10 a.m., a weekly check-in I'd established to discuss her projects and career goals. I was curious to see how she'd handle facing me after what happened. She didn't show up. Her supervisor, Helen Chang, knocked on my office door around 10:30. "Diana, I'm sorry to bother you, but Jenna called in sick today. She sounded pretty upset." On the phone. "I see," I said, making a note in my planner. "Has she seemed distracted lately? Any performance issues I should be aware of?" Helen hesitated. "Actually, yes. For the past few weeks, she's been stepping away to take personal calls, sometimes for 20-30 minutes at a time. And yesterday, she left 2 hours early, claiming she had a family emergency." "Interesting. Thank you for letting me know. Please document these incidents going forward." After Helen left, I called our IT department. As VP of Operations, I had authorization to review system access logs for security purposes. What I found was fascinating. Jenna had been using the company Wi-Fi to exchange hundreds of text messages and calls with a number I recognized, Marcus's cell phone. But more concerning was that she'd accessed confidential client files she had, no business viewing, including financial reports and contract negotiations for our biggest accounts. I printed everything. Then I called our legal department and requested a copy of our company's social media and electronics policy, the employee handbook section on workplace relationships, and the confidentiality agreement every intern signs on their first day. Page 23 of the employee handbook was crystal clear. Romantic or sexual relationships between employees of significantly different hierarchical levels or between employees and interns are strictly prohibited due to inherent power imbalances and potential for exploitation. Violations may result in immediate termination. Page 8 of the confidentiality agreement was equally unambiguous. Unauthorized access to client files or sharing of confidential company information, regardless of intent, constitutes grounds for immediate dismissal and potential legal action. I had her dead to rights on 2 separate violations that had nothing to do with my personal situation. Building the case. Over the next week, I became a detective in my own life. I hired Patricia Williams, a private investigator recommended by one of my attorney friends. I also retained David Chen, widely regarded as Seattle's most effective divorce lawyer. Patricia's findings were worse than I'd imagined. Marcus and Jenna weren't just having an affair. They were planning their future together. Patricia had photos of them apartment hunting in Capitol Hill, looking at rings in jewelry stores and having intimate dinners where Marcus was clearly promising her the world. But the most damaging evidence came from Marcus himself. In his arrogance, he'd been sloppy with his electronics. Our shared iCloud account still synchronized his messages, and Patricia helped me access months of communication between them. The texts were nauseating. Marcus: "Once Diana and I split everything 50-50, we'll have enough to start fresh. Maybe move to Portland, get a place by the water." Jenna: "What about my job? I love working at Meridian." Marcus: "Baby, you won't need to work. I'll take care of you. Besides, Diana won't make it easy for you there once she finds out about us." Jenna: "I've been copying some of her client files just in case we need leverage later." Marcus: "Smart girl. Always thinking ahead." My hands shook as I read that exchange. Not from emotion, but from sheer rage at their stupidity. They had just handed me corporate espionage on a silver platter. But the text that sealed their fate came 3 days later. Marcus: "I talked to my buddy Jake, who works in legal. He says Washington is a community property state, so Diana can't screw me over in the divorce. I'm entitled to half of everything. The house, her stock options, the whole investment portfolio. We're looking at almost $500K just as a starting point." Jenna: "Enough to start our own tech company?" Marcus: "Why not? You've got all that inside information on Meridian's clients. We could undercut their contracts and steal their business." I forwarded that entire conversation to David Chen immediately. The trap. David Chen's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. We would let Marcus believe he was in control while systematically destroying any legal standing he might have in our divorce. "The beauty of this situation," David explained during our meeting, "is that he's documenting his own misconduct. Every text message about hiding assets, every plan to steal your company's clients, every admission of manipulating a teenager, it's all admissible evidence. First, we needed to protect my assets. I opened a separate bank account and began documenting every penny of my individual contributions to our joint investments. Washington might be a community property state, but adultery combined with plans to steal marital assets created entirely different legal circumstances. Second, we laid a trap. I started acting like the defeated, heartbroken wife Marcus expected me to be. I began staying late at work, not because I was avoiding him, but because I was documenting everything and building my case. When he called to check on me, I played my part perfectly. I know I haven't been the wife you needed, I told him during one particularly nauseating phone conversation. Maybe we can work this out. I love you, Marcus. His response was predictable. I love you too, Diana, but I need time to figure out what I want. What he wanted, according to the private investigator's reports, was to string me along while he and Jenna planned their exit strategy. They were waiting until her internship ended in 6 weeks, at which point Marcus would file for divorce and demand his fair share of everything I'd worked for. Meanwhile, I was preparing for the war they didn't know was coming. The execution. Jenna returned to work the following Monday, acting as if nothing had happened. She even had the audacity to apologize for missing our meeting, claiming she'd had food poisoning. I'm so sorry, Diana. I know how much you've invested in my professional development. I almost laughed at the irony. Don't worry about it, Jenna. These things happen. Why don't we reschedule for Thursday? I'd love to hear about your long-term career goals. She looked nervous, but agreed. That Thursday morning, I met with Helen Chang, our head of IT security, and Robert Kim from legal. I presented them with the evidence of Jenna's unauthorized access to client files and her violation of the confidentiality agreement. This is serious, Robert said, reviewing the documented breaches. Corporate espionage, even by an intern, exposes the company to significant liability. What's our standard protocol for this type of violation? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Immediate termination and a full investigation to determine what information was compromised. Then let's proceed accordingly. At 2 p.m., Jenna arrived for our scheduled meeting. Instead of finding just me in the conference room, she encountered Helen, Robert, and myself, along with a security guard. The color drained from her face immediately. Ms. Rodriguez, Robert began formally, we need to discuss some serious policy violations that have come to our attention. He laid out the evidence methodically, the unauthorized file access, the confidentiality breaches, the personal use of company resources. With each revelation, Jenna looked smaller and more frightened. I don't understand, she stammered. I was just trying to learn about different aspects of the business. Helen pulled up the access logs on her laptop. According to our records, you accessed the Morrison Industries contract files 17 times over the past 2 weeks. Morrison Industries isn't even in your department or related to any of your assigned projects. And here, Robert continued, showing printouts of her activity, you downloaded confidential salary information for senior staff members, proprietary client communication strategies, and upcoming bid proposals for 3 major contracts. Jenna's voice was barely a whisper. I can explain? I'm sure you can, I said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. But the explanation isn't relevant. The policy violations are clear and documented. Your internship is terminated immediately. Effective now, the security guard stepped forward. Ms. Rodriguez, I need you to gather your personal belongings. You have 10 minutes and I'll need to escort you throughout the building. As she stood on shaking legs, tears streaming down her face, I felt no satisfaction. Just cold, calculated justice. Jenna, I said as she reached the door, I genuinely believed in your potential. That makes this particularly disappointing. After she left, Robert turned to me. Should we pursue legal action? The theft of proprietary information is a felony under Washington state law. Let's see. How cooperative she is during the investigation, I replied. Sometimes the threat is more effective than the execution. That evening, Marcus called me in a fury. What the hell did you do to Jenna? She's sobbing, saying you fired her for no reason. I fired her for violating company policy, I said calmly. Multiple policies, actually. It's all documented. This is bullshit, Diana. You're just being vindictive because of us. Marcus, I fired her because she committed corporate espionage. Her relationship with you is irrelevant to that fact. There was a long pause. What do you mean, corporate espionage? I mean she stole confidential client files and proprietary company information. There's a possibility of criminal charges. Another pause. Longer this time. I could practically hear him processing the implications. Diana, let's not let this get out of hand. Maybe we can work something out. I think it's already out of hand, don't you? We'll talk soon. I hung up and poured myself another glass of wine. Phase 1 was complete. The revelation. The next morning, I found Marcus sitting in my office parking garage at 7 a.m. He looked like he hadn't slept, and there was a desperate energy about him that I'd never seen before. We need to talk, he said, approaching my car as I parked. Then talk. Not here. Meet me for coffee. That place on Pine Street where we had our first date anniversary last year. An hour later, we sat, across from each other in a corner booth. Marcus looked haggard, nervous, and definitively not in control of the situation for the first time since this began. Diana, I need you to drop the investigation into Jenna. Why would I do that? Because... He struggled with the words. Because... Some of those files she accessed, I asked her to get them. There it was, the admission I'd been waiting for. You asked her to steal confidential information from my company. Not steal. Just look at. I was curious about how successful Meridian really was, how secure your position was there. I stared at him for a long moment. Marcus, do you understand what you just told me? I told you that I made a mistake and I need your help to fix it. No, I said quietly. You told me that you conspired to commit corporate espionage against my employer. You manipulated a teenager into jeopardizing her career and potentially committing a felony. Also, you could, what? Evaluate my worth as a wife? Based on corporate financial data? His face went pale. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? Marcus leaned forward, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the manipulative charm that had once swept me off my feet. Diana, we can fix this. All of it. I'll end things with Jenna. We can go to therapy. Start over. And the corporate espionage? Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Young intern got overeager, accessed files she shouldn't have. No harm, no foul. I nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting proposal. Hope flickered in his eyes. But here's what's actually going to happen, I continued. I'm filing for divorce on Monday. I'm citing adultery, conspiracy to commit theft, and your documented plans to defraud me of marital assets. What documented plans? I pulled out my phone and began reading from his text messages. Once Diana and I split everything 50-50, we'll have enough to start fresh. That was you, 3 weeks ago. Then there's this gem. You've got all that inside information on Meridian's clients. We could undercut their contracts and steal their business. Marcus went white as a sheet. How do you have those? You forgot we share an iCloud account. Every text, every call, every photo of you two apartment hunting and ring shopping. I have it all. He slumped back in the booth, finally understanding the scope of his situation. Diana, please, I was just talking. I never would have actually what? Actually stolen my company's clients? Actually defrauded me in the divorce? Actually manipulated a teenager into committing crimes for you? I leaned forward. Marcus, the only reason you and your girlfriend aren't facing criminal charges right now is because I haven't decided if it's worth the paperwork. But make no mistake, you have zero leverage in this situation. The aftermath. The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal. David Chen had built an airtight case that painted Marcus not as a cheating husband seeking his fair share, but as a conspirator who had actively worked to undermine our marriage and steal from my employer. The text messages were damning, but the real nail in the coffin came when Jenna, faced with potential criminal charges, cooperated fully with the investigation. She provided detailed statements about how Marcus had encouraged her to access client files, had suggested ways to copy information without detection, and had explicitly discussed using the stolen data to start a competing business. Under Washington state law, Marcus's conspiracy to steal marital assets and commit corporate espionage voided any claim he might have had to community property. The judge was particularly harsh in his assessment. Mr. Foster, Judge Martinez said during the final hearing, you have demonstrated a pattern of manipulation, conspiracy, and attempted fraud that goes far beyond marital infidelity. Your deliberate actions to undermine your wife's career and steal from her employer represent a breach of fiduciary duty that eliminates any reasonable claim to the assets she earned through her professional efforts. Marcus got nothing. Not the house, not the investment portfolio, not the stock options, not even alimony. The judge ordered him to pay my legal fees and granted me a restraining order based on his threats during the proceedings. But the real poetic justice came 3 months later. Marcus and Jenna, now unemployed and unemployable in their respective fields, had moved in together in a studio apartment in a less desirable part of Seattle. Marcus's employer had fired him after learning about his involvement in corporate espionage, and word had spread quickly through his industry. Jenna, blacklisted from tech internships and with a documented history of confidentiality violations, was working at a shopping mall retail chain. The final blow came when Marcus's mother, Margaret, whom I'd always had a good relationship with, called me personally. Diana, I want you to know that I told Marcus he made the biggest mistake of his life. That girl he's with now, she's nothing but trouble. They're living in my basement because neither of them can afford rent anywhere else. I'm sorry you're dealing with this, Margaret. Don't you be sorry, honey. You did what you had to do. I'm just calling because I wanted to ask you something. What's that? That tech company you're starting, the one I read about in the business journal. Are you hiring? My neighbor's daughter just graduated with a computer science degree, and she's looking for opportunities with ethical companies. I smiled. The business journal article had run the previous week, announcing my departure from Meridian Tech Solutions to launch my own consulting firm, Foster Analytics. I'd used my stock options and investment portfolio to fund the startup, and we'd already landed 3 major clients. Tell her to send me her resume, I said. 6 months later, Foster Analytics occupied a sleek office space in downtown Bellevue, with 12 employees and a growing reputation for excellent client service and absolute integrity. Our confidentiality agreements were ironclad, our security protocols were industry-leading, and our employee handbook explicitly prohibited the kind of exploitation that had destroyed Jenna's career. I kept a framed photo on my desk from our company launch party, a room full of talented, ethical professionals who understood that success came from competence and integrity, not manipulation and shortcuts. Sometimes late at night, when I was alone in my beautiful house, I would think about Marcus and Jenna in Margaret's basement. I didn't take joy in their situation, but I felt no guilt about it either. They had made their choices, and I had simply ensured they faced the natural consequences of those choices. The divorce had taught me something important about myself. I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, and more ruthless than I'd ever needed to be. Marcus had underestimated me because he'd mistaken my loyalty for weakness, my dedication for naivety. He learned too late that the woman who had built a successful career through intelligence and hard work was perfectly capable of protecting what she'd earned. At our final mediation session, as Marcus sat next to his public defender, he couldn't afford a private attorney. He looked at me with something I'd never seen from him before. Genuine respect. I never knew you had it in you, he said quietly during a break. You never bothered to find out, I replied. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the lesson I'd learned. Revenge, when executed properly, isn't about anger or hatred. It's about ensuring that people face appropriate consequences for their actions. It's about refusing to be a victim just because someone expects you to be. Marcus had wanted to take everything I'd worked for and give it to a teenager who thought theft was an acceptable career strategy. Instead, they ended up with nothing. And I ended up with everything, including the knowledge that I could handle whatever life threw at me. Some people might call what I did vindictive. I prefer to think of it as educational. Marcus and Jenna learned that actions have consequences, and I learned that I'm stronger than any challenge someone might put in my path. Justice isn't always swift, but when it's methodical and thorough, it tends to be permanent. And sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually win. Epilogue. A year later, I received a wedding invitation addressed to my old house, the one Marcus had expected to inherit half of in the divorce. Jenna Rodriguez was marrying some guy she'd met at her retail job, and they'd had the audacity to send me an announcement. I threw it away without a second thought, but Margaret called me that same week with an update that I did find interesting. Marcus had moved out of her basement and was living with the newest woman he'd convinced to support him, a divorced teacher in her 50s who didn't know about his history. Some people never learn, Margaret said with a sigh, but some people never have to learn the same lesson twice. She was right. I definitely fell into the second category. As I hung up the phone and returned to reviewing contracts for Foster Analytics' newest client, a major tech company that had specifically sought us out because of our reputation for security and integrity, I realized that the best revenge really is living well. Marcus had wanted to tear down everything I'd built. Instead, he'd simply removed himself from the equation and freed me to build something even better. Sometimes karma needs a little help. Sometimes it just needs someone with the patience to let natural consequences play out completely. And sometimes, justice is simply a matter of refusing to let someone else write the ending to your story.